Well, I'm joined now by Klain, non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, a non-partisan organization promoting U.S. global leadership, joining us live. Thank you so much for joining us on Newsday. Firstly, can you just talk us through exactly what conditions does Ukraine have to meet before joining NATO?
Thanks for having me. That's the big question. What Ukraine was really asking for out of this summit was not automatic NATO membership. Ukraine was asking for a clear path and details on what it takes to join the NATO alliance. What Ukraine is really frustrated about from today's communique from NATO is this phrasing that Ukraine will be able to join at some point in the future when allies agree and conditions are met. What those conditions are is unclear. But Ukraine has showed that it is willing to make reforms and make changes to meet whatever conditions it needs to join the NATO alliance. For Ukraine, it's a matter of survival.
I guess the compromise offered by NATO is this Ukraine Council. Can you just talk us through what it is?
Well, this is going to be a new forum that will allow Ukraine and NATO to engage in closer cooperation and closer integration. It will be something that's probably a net positive and gives Ukraine more avenues to pursue Euro-Atlantic integration. But for a lot of observers, it's going to be something that looks pretty similar, I think, to the NATO-Russia Council, something that started in the 90s and never proved to be all that effective or impactful of a forum.
I also want to ask you about cluster bombs because they are the hot topic going into this NATO summit. What do you make of, I guess, difference in opinions?
Sure. So I think that first, it's good to remember that this was a hard decision for the White House to make. It's something that the White House did not initially want to do, but Ukraine made a convincing argument for why it needed these munitions. I think that something that everybody should remember is that nobody knows the risk to civilians better than Ukraine. Ukrainians have been fighting this war and already suffering the effects of cluster munitions for more than 500 days, as Russians have been using them. Ukraine weighed the costs of unexploded bomblets from cluster munitions, of how that could pose a risk to civilians in the future. And they weighed that up against the very real and immediate danger of Russians continuing to rampage through Ukraine and occupy territory and terrorize and kill Ukrainians. Ukraine made the hard choice of saying, we need whatever tools we can get to get Russia out of our country as soon as possible, and then begin the process of healing.
And briefly, before we let you go, there are some leaders of Western allies here in Asia who are attending the summit as well. But there has been some objections from some NATO members about closer ties with Asian countries as well, isn't there?
I think that while it's not the main topic at this NATO summit, there are plenty of NATO allies that are looking at ways where NATO and the Indo-Pacific countries can exchange knowledge, can learn from each other, and how they can cooperate in the future to ensure security both in Europe and in Asia.
Klain, thank you so much for joining us on the program this morning.